There are so many different things that you can do in this Marvel Snap metagame. My last video highlighting some underrated and underplayed decks did super well, so I wanted to revisit that. Here are 3 decks absolutely nobody is talking about that I played in Top 10 Infinite. Now, you might have noticed that I bear a more than passing resemblance to one Jeff the Baby Land Shark. That's because we hit a Twitch sub goal, and I like to commit when people hit my cosplay sub goals, they also make it to YouTube. In line with that, I started out playing a Jeff deck. The idea here was Jeff used to be the greatest card in Marvel Snap. They just changed Professor X in order to allow spells to actually work with him. This means that there are some very clever plays you can make with a deck like this that is using not just Professor X, but also things like Werewolf by Night that can jump into and out of Professor X lanes to either dodge interaction or win those Professor X lanes. But you also have stuff like the spells from Agamotto, which can be incredibly impactful in Professor X lanes. And Merlin Werewolf is a time-tested thing that allows you to put power on the board in real ways. This is a deck that uses Jeff as a sort of auxiliary piece. There's a lot of good 2s in the game, but none of them are as good with Professor X as Jeff is. And so that's why it's where I wanted to start. This deck was cooked up by Ika, and there's a lot of really cool stuff going on here. I talked briefly about the spells and Professor X thing, the fact that you can play spells under Professor X. For example, Professor X in a Merlin Polymorph is legitimately very powerful. The fact that Luna Snow can get Professor X out on turn 4 is legitimately very powerful. And of course, your typical Werewolf spells deck, which has just been a generally strong thing to be doing already in the context of this game. What this deck doesn't have is any tech. It's a deck that is sort of one-track minded about this. Like, yeah, we have an Enchantress, but that is not going to be a real tech card a lot of the time. Like, genuinely, a shocking amount of the time, Enchantress is a 4/6. We do not have Shang-Chi. We might need Shang-Chi, but a lot of the stuff that interacts profitably with our Professor X game plans is stuff that we actually need Enchantress for and not Shang-Chi, which is an awkward kind of thing to actually do in your deck building. Like, there are things like Claw or Living Tribunal that are actively bad for us that Shang-Chi will not answer, but Enchantress will if we're investing heavily in Professor X lanes actually happening. Now, the main thing this deck is doing is fairly similar to other Agamotto decks. You might look at it and see something along the lines of Agamotto with Annihilus in it, but the top end is very different. It's much more built to stop your opponent from doing stuff, and a good Professor X can be one of the most dangerous things in the entire game. A good, strong Prof X can let you win matchups that basically nothing else can. Oh, I won a Hela matchup. They just don't get to summon anything back. That kind of stuff is extremely powerful. Oh, I have a 10 power card that I expect them to Shang-Chi. That's really powerful too, because you can turn off their Shang-Chi. This is also a deck that has multiple ways of ramping into Prof X setups. If you Bolts of Balthak early in the game, you can get stats and Prof X down. A Nick Scratch, maybe a Jeff comes into that lane later, you get some stats down, you get your Prof X down. It is very dangerous to be able to threaten that you can win lanes early. In fact, of all of the decks that I've played with Agamotto in them, this is the list that is the most Bolts of Balthak sort of unique, in the sense of, like, it is the one that is very much willing to play it on basically any turn, whereas a lot of other ones, unless you're doing something really specific, are going to be asking you to pretty much just play it on the final turn, on the second to last turn of the game, so you get the energy on the final turn of the game. This deck uses bolts in a very proactive way, very powerfully, in large part because Professor X prevents there from being any sort of reactive answer to him. He just does what he does, and there's nothing that can, like, make you feel bad for investing in him short of other move cards that allow your opponent to get in there. So on the whole, I found this deck to be very compelling. It was quite solid. I had an enjoyable time with it, and I hope you do as well. Next up is a Morgan Le Fay list that I'm referring to as the Xenangle. And the Xenangle is a reference to the creator Xenade, who has been sort of one-tricking Morgan Le Fay recently, and I think he's arrived at a pretty compelling build. Now, the first thing you'll notice about this build is it is relatively light on the important tech to interact with the metagame, but it has Juggernaut and it has points, which means it is going to be able to do its thing when it does its thing. This is a deck that plays a lot of really close games, but ultimately Juggernaut and a bunch of Morgan Le Fay 1-drops is a very powerful endgame strategy against mid-range decks. This is one of those things where you have a strategy that is fairly limited in terms of total output and interaction. Decks that are able to go vastly over the top of you are going to go vastly over the top of you. You're going to need to have proper stay and retreat mechanics when you play a deck like this, because it is so specialized at being a deck that tries to beat up mid-range decks with a combination of cheap points and Juggernaut. And don't get me wrong, that is a very good recipe to beat up a lot of the tech slop decks. If people are relying on cards like Shang-Chi and Enchantress to be good, you can make them not good. There is a notable downside. You might be aware of this, but I recently posted a video on Invisible Woman Sarah, and a Killmonger under Invisible Woman can actually be kind of devastating a decent amount of the time when you are dealing with those kind of decks, but most of the other tech slop decks you'll be able to play real games of Marvel Snap against. Now, Morgan Le Fay is not the world's greatest card, and this is definitely a deck where things have to go right for you more than they have to go right for your opponent. But what I really wanted to focus on are the inclusions of, and this is legitimately notable, the inclusions of Angel and Makari. And I think those are really interesting inclusions to me. I have really enjoyed both of them as these kind of things where it's okay, you have more stuff now from this deck to make sure that you are getting value out of Morgan Le Fay. You get a Makari down early, you play a 1-drop in that lane, you blow it up, you get some points, Angel goes on the board, you Morgan Le Fay, you get your 1-drop back, maybe another 1-drop that you might have gotten in there, and then you also get back Makari, who shows up in another lane. You just really want to be doing as much destroy into Morgan as possible. But that is ultimately the problem. You're doing this destroy into Morgan stuff, and it's okay, I'm doing awesome stuff. I'm playing this underrated card. I'm doing things that are legitimately powerful, a bunch of 1/5s. She's basically a factory that makes demons, give or take a point of power. Most of what she brings back is just demons. And so you get to have these final turns that are demon, 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 effectively, and then a Juggernaut. And that's a good enough plan to work. The problem is, this is probably not the best way to be a demon, demon, demon Juggernaut deck, because you could just be doing the V-hand stuff instead. Example, here, just a little digression, this kind of stuff is really what the Morgan Le Fay deck is sort of imitating, if you ask me. It is doing this thing, and it is trying to do it in a different way. The problem is that the V-hand deck doesn't have as prescriptive of a game plan. It doesn't die if you don't draw V-hand, you're still doing other stuff that is legitimately powerful. This deck, if you don't draw Morgan, you end up in a ton of trouble. It's very difficult to get out of those games. So the real way to think about this, and I had a very good record with the Morgan deck, but I do think it is most reasonably described as a sort of budget version of the V-hand deck. I know I said 3 decks at the outset, maybe we'll call it 3.5, because I think this deck is obviously, while popular, still a deck that has not yet percolated down to lower ranks in a meaningful way. It's a strong and powerful package of interaction that has different ways of applying pressure to different decks, and like the version of the Morgan deck that we just saw, this is a deck that is not really able to profitably interact with things that are going super, super tall, but it is very able to profitably interact with tech slop Shang decks, which it is very good against. The only thing this deck is really afraid of is Killmonger type stuff, and it's not nearly as good at throwing priority into your Killmonger vulnerability as the Morgan Le Fay deck is, but that's kind of an upside, right? This is a deck that is not as good at throwing priority as the Morgan deck, because it's better. Because it does more strong stuff, it doesn't get to throw priority as much. So with that in mind, I'm not necessarily going to sit here and say Morgan is in a great spot, but I was able to legitimately win multiple games in a row with this deck in high infinite. There is something to be said for just being able to play points. I don't think it's the world's most amazing deck, but it goes to show just how playable anything with points and a modicum of interaction is in a mid-range soup metagame. Last up is this deck, which was cooked up by a player named Iris. Now, Iris is someone who I've been noticing a lot near the top 10, top 15, always playing weird stuff when I play against her, and doing things that are generally pretty impressive to me, both in terms of snaps and in terms of the decks that she plays. This is a deck that I think is just doing a magnificent job at taking an alternate angle on the metagame. There are so many cards in here that just are not particularly highly regarded. This is an Ancient One deck. This is a Miss Marvel deck. There's no Galacta in here. There's no Gwenpool in here. There's a Rhino in here. And that was actually what drove me towards wanting to play this, is like, what I really liked about the deck was the way it used Luna Snow and Rhino to make sure that you had bodies for either A, Merlin cycles for extra energy, or B, making sure that Miss Marvel is on. So there's a lot of strong stuff you can do here. The number one thing this deck wants to do is play Sarah on turn 4. You have Penny Parker that can facilitate that, you have Luna Snow that can facilitate that, and you have Surge that can facilitate that if she's not in your hand. Once you have Sarah on turn 4, the rest of what you're trying to do is figure out if you can win with some really dumb combination of multiple ongoings in the Ancient One. 3 Claws, 3 Miss Marvels, that kind of stuff is the direction you're headed. Now, there is also a legitimate amount of tech in here, but it's fairly limited in terms of its scope. This is a deck that has, a Shadow King and a Shang-Chi, but we're not sitting here looking at Enchantress. We have our Killmonger, but we're not really looking at a Rogue. So there are blind spots in our tech makeup here. This deck was legitimately very strong for me. I really enjoyed playing it, and I liked that it was a different angle that used these cards that otherwise would not ever see play in unique and powerful ways. Turboing out an early Sarah into some weird pseudo combo of cards, but also at the same time still being able to play meaningful tech-based games with points coming out of it. I haven't had this experience since like the beta. All the Sarah decks I've been playing have been like really straightforward stats things, right? Like just the quickest way to get stats. Hitmonkey stuff, Mysterio stuff, Gwenpool stuff. And this deck gets to just like notch that by just going taller. There are games where like you are legitimately able to, on the final turn of the game, put 15 power in both of the side lanes, and they had no idea it could possibly happen other than having seen you play a 3/5 Ancient One and sort of scratching their head. And I think that this is really indicative of a really impressive deck building work, personally. Now, I had a ton of fun playing this. I think of these 3 decks, this is the one that I legitimately enjoyed the most. It's just felt like I was never out of any game. It felt like I was always in things. Although I definitely lost some 8-cubers guessing wrong on Shang locations, right? Like, this is a deck that's always in games, but it's never winning them by like a million. I feel like it was pretty tough for me to snap with this deck because it just sort of felt like every time I thought I was going to go over the top of somebody with something overpowering, it turns out I wasn't going over the top enough. I'll tell you something else. This deck really got hurt by the Claw nerf. Like, if we could get Claw back to 8 power, this deck would be so much better. There is a lot to say for, like, the ability to do that really cool Miss Marvel stuff after a turn 4 Sarah. There is a lot to say for a deck this good at making sure that a turn 4 Sarah actually happens. I think this is a good deck if everyone is playing mid-range soup slop decks. You're just going to be able to outpoints a lot of people. Now, the problem is, sometimes it's a little telegraphed, sometimes you're a little vulnerable to Enchantress, and all the time you're incredibly vulnerable to Mobius and Mobius. But basically, this deck does a lot of legitimate points. It has some unique and powerful final turn scams, and 3 Miss Marvels is absolutely nothing to shake your head at. That's just straight up a good thing. In terms of playing it, it actually is really hard. There's so many things that you have to plan out in terms of future positioning. One of the things that really sticks out to me is you should basically never have Sarah in the middle. She's almost always going to want to go on the right lane. The reason she's going to want to go on the right lane is because the middle is your best Miss Marvel lane, and Claw is never going to go on the right lane. And if you end up having 2 ongoings in the same lane, well, you're 50-50ing which one of them Tau Mandala is actually going to copy. In the same way, when you are playing cards early, it can be easy to just like, oh, I'm going to vomit out a bunch of cards, it's going to be great. And then you realize you've turned off your own Miss Marvel because you have a Merlin and a Surge in the same lane. That's another thing that really comes up a lot. I tend to enjoy playing those cards in the middle because I know I'm going to want bodies there, while Sarah almost always ends up going on the right. Now, you have other things that are able to generate bodies. Keep in mind that, of course, you have to keep track of this stuff through polymorph as well. You're going to be looking at, say, polymorphing the rock that comes off of a Rhino. That means that it's a 2-drop, which means Rhino and the 2-drop are on the same location, which is bad. So you very often want to be flushing the rock away for extra energy instead. There's just a lot to think about when it comes to this deck, and your positioning early can actually really screw you over late, and your opponent's ability to put stuff on the board maybe can screw you over late as well. There's just a ton going on here. It's difficult to play, but I honestly feel like it is just an absolute blast, and I had like a 65% win rate with it. This deck is just straight up good. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. I wanted to make this video not just because my previous video of this type got a lot of good reception, but because I think there is a lot to say about the negative sides of Marvel Snap, and I have certainly focused on some of the negatives recently, but I don't think anyone wants someone to be 100% negative 100% of the time, and so I wanted to talk about what is good, and right now it's the gameplay. Like, there was someone in my chat who was like, coming over from Hearthstone, it's actually crazy how many decks that you can play and still succeed with. And I think stuff like this is a great example. These are not on anyone's tier list. They are all exploring new frontiers of what is possible, many using cards that everyone seems to think are crap. I had a great session with these decks. Straight up, I did. I was going to have more decks on here, but they tanked the session. It took all of my willpower and yelling at everything in order to get back to where I started, but I will note, in so doing, that requires about a 66% win rate for me right now. So that's what these decks added up to. These 3 decks were legitimately amazing for me. All of them were straight up good, and none of them are the kind of thing that anyone has on their radar. So now you should have them on your radar. I hope you get some good value out of them. Thanks so much for watching. I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one. I'm realizing right now that what I should have said is, I've been KM Jeff, you've been phenomenal, and I'll see you in the next one.